Caleb Turner had spent most of his life moving from one dusty trail to another. He was a cowboy who knew the open land better than any town. That morning, he was riding back from a long cattle delivery. The sun was high, the air felt dry, and the Arizona desert stretched as far as he could see. Nothing seemed unusual, until he noticed a thin line of smoke rising from a group of rocks ahead. Smoke in the middle of such empty land rarely meant anything good. It could be a campfire left behind, or it could mean trouble. Caleb slowed his horse, narrowed his eyes, and kept riding toward it. As he came closer, something inside him warned that something was wrong. The smoke wasn't rising the way a cooking fire would. It looked scattered and messy, almost like something had been burned in a hurry. Caleb moved carefully. He guided his horse behind a few tall rocks and stepped down quietly. He knew that out here, mistakes could cost a life. He tied his horse loosely, took his rifle just in case, and walked forward slowly, scanning every shadow. The smell hit him first, burned wood, and something else, something sharp and unsettling. His steps grew slower. He saw the remains of a small wagon that had been burned almost completely. The wheels were black, the wooden sides were broken, and ashes floated in the wind. Caleb's chest tightened. He had seen scenes like this before, and they never ended well. Then he saw movement, a weak, small motion on the ground. Caleb rushed forward and found a woman lying there, struggling to breathe. Her skin was warm with fever, and dark stains marked her side. She wore a beaded necklace and traditional Apache clothing. Her long dark hair was tangled from dust and wind. She looked up at him when he knelt beside her. Even though she was in pain, her eyes were full of strength. Caleb knew she didn't have much time. He held her hand gently and spoke softly, telling her he meant no harm. She blinked slowly and whispered her name, Nahi. Her voice trembled with every breath. Caleb tried to give her water, but she could barely swallow. He looked around, searching for anyone else. Maybe others had survived. Maybe someone needed help. He noticed a small blanket near the wagon, half hidden behind a broken crate. He walked toward it carefully. When he lifted the blanket, he found a little girl curled up underneath, trembling like a frightened animal. She had wide, dark eyes and a small face marked with dirt and tears. She looked no older than 8. The moment she saw Caleb, she pulled back, afraid he might hurt her. Caleb slowly lowered his hands and spoke to her softly, telling her he would not harm her. After a moment, she whispered her name, Aponi. Caleb realized that these two were likely the only survivors of the attack. He didn't know who had done this, but he could guess. There were always roaming outlaws in this part of the land, men who thought stealing from travelers was easier than working. It made his stomach twist with anger, but right now, anger could wait. The wounded woman needed help. So did the child. He went back to Nahi and told her that her daughter was safe. The woman smiled weakly. Her hand reached out, and Caleb gently placed a pony beside her. The girl clung to her mother's arm, crying silently. Caleb felt his heart grow heavy. He knew the look in Nahi's eyes, the look of someone who understood her time was almost over. She had the calm fear of a mother who only worried about her child. Nahi turned her gaze to Caleb. Her voice dropped to a whisper so soft that he had to lean close to hear. She struggled to speak, every breath a battle. She said she had no other family nearby. Her group had been traveling to meet relatives when the attack happened. She closed her eyes, trying to gather strength. Then she whispered the words that would change Caleb's life forever. "I'm leaving my daughter to you." Caleb froze. For a moment, he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. He stared at her, shocked. Him? A rough cowboy who barely knew how to take care of himself sometimes? Someone who lived alone on a small ranch where silence was his closest companion. He wasn't the man anyone would choose to raise a little girl. He didn't have family. He didn't have a wife. and he certainly didn't have experience with children. But Nahi's eyes held steady. She trusted him. In that moment, Caleb felt the weight of her request settle heavily on his shoulders. He looked at Aponi, who was still holding her mother's hand. The little girl's eyes were filled with fear, confusion, and a quiet plea for safety. Caleb swallowed hard and placed his hand gently on Nahi's arm. He whispered that he would do his best. He didn't know how, but he couldn't leave the child alone in the desert. He couldn't say no to a mother's last wish. Nahi gave a faint nod. A single tear rolled down her face. A few minutes later, her breathing slowed. Caleb held her hand until the last breath left her body. Aponi let out a soft cry and buried her face in her mother's clothing. Caleb had seen death before, but this one hit him differently. He felt as if someone had placed a delicate responsibility into his hands, something he could not ignore. Once it was over, Caleb stood up slowly. The wind brushed across the burned wagon, pushing ash across the ground like dark snow. He wrapped Nahi's body with a blanket he found nearby. He worked with respect and silence, knowing the girl watched every move. When he finished, he knelt beside the little girl again. Aponi didn't speak, but she didn't pull away from him either. She looked exhausted, lost, and too shocked to understand what her life had just become. Caleb lifted her gently. She weighed almost nothing, like a small bird. He carried her to his horse and placed her in front of him. She held onto his shirt with small, shaking hands. He whispered comforting words, hoping she understood, even if she didn't know his language completely. He took one last look at the burned wagon and the quiet form under the blanket. Then, he turned his horse toward the nearest settlement, Hollow Creek. The ride was long, and the sun grew hotter. Caleb made sure the girl drank water and stayed close to him for support. Every now and then, she looked up at him with confused, teary eyes. He tried to smile softly, telling her she was safe now. The land around them slowly shifted from rocky desert to open fields as they approached the town. When they reached the edge of Hollow Creek, people stopped and stared. Cowboys, shopkeepers, and townsfolk paused to watch Caleb ride in with an Apache child in his arms. Whispers started immediately. Caleb felt their eyes on him, heavy and judging. But he didn't stop. He rode straight to the sheriff's office, knowing he had to report what had happened. The sheriff came out, puzzled. He asked what Caleb had brought with him. Caleb explained everything: the burned wagon, the attack, the dying mother, and her last request. The sheriff listened carefully but frowned as soon as Caleb mentioned the mother's last words. Most people in town were not used to seeing a cowboy take responsibility for an Apache child. They wondered why he hadn't simply brought her for the government to handle. But Caleb didn't care about their opinions. He just knew he couldn't abandon her. He felt the weight of Nahi's trust still resting on him. A mother had given him her final wish, and he wasn't going to break it. That day, the town saw something they had never expected. A lone cowboy, dusty and tired, walked through their streets with an Apache girl at his side, determined to protect her, even though he had no idea what challenges he would face next. And although he didn't say it out loud, deep inside, he had already made a silent promise to the woman he had left behind under the desert sun. He would not let her daughter face this world alone. Caleb Turner stood outside the sheriff's office with Aponi holding onto his sleeve, her small hand gripping him as tightly as she could. The people of Hollow Creek stared from a distance, whispering among themselves. Some looked confused, others concerned, and a few openly disapproved. An Apache child standing beside a cowboy was something the town rarely saw. Caleb felt all those eyes on him, but he stayed calm. Aponi's fear mattered more than the judgment of strangers. The sheriff, a tall man named Oliver Granger, folded his arms while studying the girl. He wasn't unkind, but he was a man who followed rules. Caleb explained everything again, slowly and clearly: how he had found the burned wagon, how the mother had spoken her last request, and how the girl was now alone with no family nearby. I understand what happened, Sheriff Granger said. But this is a big responsibility. We usually send children like her to the federal agents. They know what to do. Ride. When clued. We can't savon ride. Ride. We can't have wet to the federals bod. Aponi didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. Her small fingers tightened around Caleb's sleeve, and she stepped closer to him. Caleb placed a calming hand on her shoulder. His jaw clenched slightly. He knew what sending her to agents meant. Children were taken far from their homes, placed in cold boarding schools, and raised by strangers who didn't care about their language or culture. He had heard stories. Some never returned. Caleb shook his head. No. I promised her mother I'd care for her. The sheriff looked surprised. You? You live alone, Caleb. How will you care for a little girl? It's not an easy job. Caleb didn't have a perfect answer. But he had something stronger than logic. A promise that had settled in his heart like a stone. I'll learn, he replied simply. She has no one else. The sheriff stared at him for a long moment. Caleb stood his ground. He was not completely sure about Caleb's decision, but he could see the seriousness in the cowboy's eyes. All right. For now, she stays with you, he agreed. But people will talk. Some won't like it. You know that, right? Caleb gave a small nod. He had lived through town gossip many times. It didn't bother him before, and it wouldn't bother him now. Let them talk, he said. She needs someone. That's all that matters. With permission granted, Caleb stepped out with Aponi. They walked toward the general store to buy supplies. As they walked down the main street, the whispers grew louder. Some folks stepped aside, watching with curiosity. A group of women near the bakery stared openly, one even covering her mouth with surprise. Two cowboys outside the saloon laughed quietly, shaking their heads. Turner's gone soft, one muttered. Raising an Apache girl? The other scoffed. He's asking for trouble. Caleb heard every word, but he didn't react. Aponi didn't understand the words, but she sensed the tone. Her grip tightened again. Caleb bent slightly and whispered, You're safe. Don't worry about them. His voice was warm, calming. The girl held on to him and followed closely. Inside the general store, old Mr. Wilson looked shocked when the bell rang, and Caleb stepped in with the girl beside him. His eyes widened. Caleb. Who is this? Caleb gave a simple explanation. Mr. Wilson listened, nodding slowly. Unlike others, he didn't judge. He sighed and gave Caleb a sympathetic look. Well, if you're taking care of her, you'll need some extra things. Caleb bought a small blanket, simple shoes for her feet, warm clothes, and a few toys, a small carved wooden horse and a tiny cloth doll. When he showed them to Aponi, she looked at them as if they were something from another world. Slowly, a faint smile touched her lips. The first smile he had seen since finding her. Caleb felt something warm rise in his chest at the sight. After finishing at the store, Caleb lifted Aponi onto his horse. She held onto the saddle tightly, still unsure, but trusting him. Caleb climbed up behind her and guided the horse out of town. As they rode, he felt her lean slightly back, her small frame relaxing just a little. The long stretch of open land appeared again, the wind brushing across their faces. Caleb breathed easier once the town was behind them. When they reached his ranch, Aponi stared at the small wooden house, the barn, and the open fields. It was a lonely place, but peaceful. Caleb helped her down and let her explore at her own pace. She looked around carefully, like a small fox trying to understand new surroundings. Caleb didn't rush her. He pointed to the house and said gently, Home. She repeated the word softly but with uncertainty. Caleb spent the next hour preparing a place for her. He cleaned the extra room he rarely used, placed the new blanket on the bed, and set the little wooden horse on a small table. The room was simple, but he tried to make it welcoming. When Aponi walked inside and saw the bed and toys, she touched the doll gently with wide eyes. Caleb smiled quietly. The rest of the evening, Caleb cooked a simple meal. Aponi watched him carefully from a distance, still unsure how safe she truly was. He placed food on the table and sat down. After a moment, she sat too. She ate slowly, watching him between bites. Caleb didn't hurry her. He just offered a calm, steady presence. When night came, he carried a small lantern and guided her to her room. She hesitated at the doorway and looked up at him. Her eyes showed fear of sleeping alone, fear of being in a strange place, fear that she might wake up with no one there. Caleb knelt beside her. "I'll be right outside. Door open. You're safe here," he said quietly. She didn't understand every word, but she understood the tone. After a moment of silence, she nodded and stepped inside. Caleb left the door slightly open and sat near the table outside her room until she fell asleep. He could hear her breathing slowly settle. Only then did he rest his head on the table, tired but relieved that she had finally found some peace. The next morning, the real challenge began. Aponi woke early and wandered out of her room quietly. She found Caleb already awake, boiling coffee and preparing simple bread. She looked around the house, touching things gently, careful not to break anything. She watched Caleb closely, trying to understand what her life would look like now. Caleb took her outside to show her the animals. The chickens clucked around them, and Aponi stepped behind Caleb when one came too close. He explained softly that they were harmless, picking one up to show her. She looked amazed when she touched its feathers. Then he took her to the barn. His horse whinnied softly, and Aponi approached with slow steps. She placed her hand on its nose, and the horse lowered its head gently. Sensing her fear, Caleb smiled. It seemed even the animals understood her situation. As the day went on, she helped him with small tasks, carrying a pail, gathering eggs, brushing the horse. She followed Caleb everywhere, watching how he worked, copying small motions. Each time she did something correctly, Caleb praised her gently. It was slow progress, but it was progress. However, not everyone agreed with Caleb's decision. By afternoon, word had spread through Hollow Creek. Two neighbors, Mr. Barnes and Mrs. Riley, rode up to Caleb's ranch. They claimed they were worried for the girl's future. They insisted a ranch was not a place for a young child and offered to take her to better people. Caleb stood at the gate, arms crossed, Aponi hiding behind him. His voice was firm when he said no. "She's staying with me." Mrs. Riley frowned deeply. "You can't keep her hidden away here," she insisted. Caleb replied calmly, "I'm not hiding her. I'm protecting her." They argued for several minutes, but Caleb didn't budge. Finally, the neighbors left, frustrated. Caleb knelt beside Aponi once they were gone and gently touched her shoulder. "You're safe," he whispered again. That night, Aponi sat near the small fire by the kitchen stove. She watched the flames, her eyes reflecting sadness and memory. Caleb sat nearby, giving her space, but letting her know he was there. After a long silence, she reached into her small belongings and pulled out a tiny woven bracelet. She placed it in Caleb's hand without speaking. Caleb stared at it, surprised. It was made with small beads in a simple pattern. He knew it was something she valued. When he looked at her, she met his eyes with a soft expression that said she understood he was trying. He closed his fingers around the bracelet and nodded, slowly. He didn't know everything she had lost, but he knew he would do everything he could to give her a safe future. That night, as the stars shone over the quiet ranch, Caleb realized fully that his decision had shocked the town, but he also knew he had done the right thing. A new life had begun, one he never expected. One where a lonely cowboy had become the guardian of a frightened, brave little girl who needed someone to stand by her. Life on the ranch slowly began to settle into a calm rhythm, even though every day brought something new for both Caleb and Apony. The first few weeks were filled with small changes, careful steps, and gentle learning. Caleb had always lived alone, doing things his own way. But now he found himself planning his days around a little girl who looked to him for safety, comfort, and guidance. Each morning, the sun rose behind the wide hills, spreading soft golden light across the ranch. Apony usually woke early, sometimes even before Caleb. She would peek into the kitchen to make sure he was there. And when she saw him, she relaxed. The first sound of the day was often her soft footsteps as she followed him outside. She stayed close to him, watching and learning. Caleb taught her how to feed the chickens. At first, she was scared when the birds ran toward her, but Caleb stood beside her and showed her how to scatter the grain. Slowly, she grew braver. She would giggle softly when a chicken pecked too quickly, then look up at Caleb to see if he noticed. He always smiled at her. Her laughter, even in small pieces, made him feel that maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to trust this new life. After the animals were fed, Caleb took her to the barn to brush the horses. The big brown mare, Daisy, became her favorite. Daisy would lower her head gently when Apony approached, as if she understood that the girl needed kindness. Apony brushed her gently with slow strokes, humming a little tune her mother had probably taught her long ago. The sound filled the barn with something peaceful, something warm. Caleb listened quietly. He could tell the tune meant something important to her, and he never interrupted. Sometimes, he found himself humming along after she finished, even when she wasn't around. It reminded him that the ranch didn't feel empty anymore. Though things were calm on the ranch, life outside was not always as soft. People in town were still unsure about Caleb's decision. Some refused to speak to him. Others whispered behind his back when he came in for supplies. A few even tried to convince him again to hand Apony over to the government agents. But every time, Caleb stood firm. His answer never changed. "She stays with me," crowed. A few days after the neighbor's visit, trouble came again. Caleb had gone into town to buy flour and tools. He took Apony with him, hoping she would grow more comfortable around people. She held his hand tightly as they walked. Some folks greeted him politely, others avoided making eye contact. A little boy stared openly at Apony, but not in a cruel way, just curious. She hid behind Caleb's coat until the boy walked away. Inside the general store, Mr. Wilson smiled warmly. He had always treated Caleb fairly, and he had grown fond of the quiet girl. He offered her a small candy stick, wrapped neatly in paper. She hesitated, unsure if she should accept it. But Caleb nodded encouragingly. She took it slowly and whispered a soft, "Thank you." Mr. Wilson's eyes warmed. "See, she's learning fast," he said with a gentle grin, but not everyone was so kind. As Caleb paid for his supplies, two men behind him muttered loud enough for him to hear. "This town ain't a place for her," one said. "Should have handed her over weeks ago," the other added. Caleb ignored them, but Apony heard their tone. Her shoulders tensed, and she stepped closer to him. Caleb wrapped an arm around her protectively and walked out of the store without a word. He didn't want her to see his anger. He didn't want her to feel it was her fault. Back at the ranch, he decided to show her something that might help her feel more at home. He brought her to a quiet spot near the edge of the land, where a small stream ran between rocks. The water was clear and cool, sparkling in the sunlight. A single cottonwood tree stood nearby, offering shade. "This is a good place," Caleb said softly. "A place to think. A place to rest." Apony touched the water with her fingertips and smiled faintly. She knelt down beside the stream and began arranging small stones into shapes, something she had likely learned from her family. Caleb sat nearby and watched her. Her small hands were quick and careful. She created a circle, then a simple pattern that looked like a flower. Caleb felt something shift inside him. Watching her reminded him that she came from a world with its own traditions, its own meaning. He didn't want her to lose that. So he asked gently, "Can you teach me? Can you teach me? Can you teach me?" She looked up, surprised. Slowly, she nodded. She guided his hands, showing him how to choose smooth stones, how to place them in a pattern. Caleb was slow and clumsy at first, but she giggled softly when he made mistakes and corrected him patiently. For the first time since her mother's death, she seemed to come alive, even if only for a moment. As days turned into weeks, Aponi opened up more. She began speaking in simple English words, using what Caleb taught her. She called him Caleb, instead of just looking at him silently. At night, she sometimes talked about her mother in soft, broken words. Caleb didn't always understand everything, but he listened. Listening was enough. One afternoon, as they were fixing the fence near the horse pasture, Caleb heard distant hoofbeats. He quickly turned, alert. A small group of riders approached the ranch, dust rising behind them. Caleb recognized two of the horses. They belonged to the same men who had muttered in the general store. The third man was unfamiliar. Aponi noticed Caleb's tense posture and stepped behind him. The men rode up to the fence with stern expressions. The unfamiliar one, a tall man with a sharp jaw, spoke first. "We're here to talk," he said. Caleb didn't lower his guard. "About what?" "About the girl," the man said. "There's talk in town. Folks think she'd be better off somewhere else." Caleb's voice was steady. "Folks can think whatever they like. She stays here." The man frowned. "You're making life harder than it needs to be." Caleb stepped forward slightly. "I don't care how hard it gets. She was entrusted to me." The men exchanged looks. One of them tried again, softer this time. "We're just saying this ain't normal." Caleb's eyes sharpened. "Not normal doesn't mean wrong." The men didn't have an answer. After a few tense moments, they turned their horses and rode away. Aponi held Caleb's hand tightly until the dust settled. Caleb knelt beside her and said gently, "You don't need to be afraid. I'm here." She nodded slowly, believing him more with each passing day. As evening came and the sky turned soft orange, Aponi helped Caleb gather wood for the fire. She worked quietly, but with purpose. When the fire crackled warmly, she sat close to it with a small piece of thread and a few colored beads she had kept hidden in a little pouch. Caleb watched her hands move carefully, weaving a small bracelet. When she finished, she held it out to him. It had a simple but meaningful pattern. Two parallel lines crossing together. Caleb looked at her, surprised. "For me?" he asked. She nodded shyly. He tied it around his wrist with slow, respectful hands. It was the first gift she had ever made for him. He felt his throat tighten with emotion he didn't show on the surface. Aponi looked pleased, though still quiet. The ranch, once a lonely place, had changed. There was laughter sometimes, soft singing, and small footsteps running across the porch. Caleb no longer woke to silence. He woke knowing someone depended on him, trusted him, and believed he would keep her safe. But trouble was never far away. A few nights later, while Caleb and Aponi slept, Daisy the horse neighed loudly, waking Caleb suddenly. He grabbed his lantern and stepped outside. The night was dark, and the air felt tense. Daisy stomped her hooves nervously. Then Caleb saw shadows moving near the barn. His heart pounded. He moved quickly, keeping the lantern low. As he got closer, he realized the figures were armed men, likely outlaws passing through, perhaps even the same ones who attacked Nahi's group. He didn't waste time. He shouted a warning, fired a shot into the air, and ran toward the barn. The outlaws scattered, surprised by his sudden appearance. Caleb chased them off the property, firing another shot to make sure they kept running. He didn't care about fighting. He only cared about protecting a pony. When the danger passed, Caleb rushed back to the house. A pony stood at the doorway, eyes wide with fear. Caleb knelt and held her tightly, telling her it was all right now. She trembled, but trusted him completely. That night, as she finally fell asleep again, Caleb sat beside her door, just like he had on the very first night. He stared at the small bracelet on his wrist. It reminded him of the promise he had made to her mother, the silent oath he lived by now. The ranch had become more than a home. It had become a place where a lonely cowboy was learning to be a father, one day at a time. Spring settled gently across the land, painting the hills with soft green and letting warm winds sweep across Caleb Turner's ranch. Months had passed since he brought a pony home, and though every day carried challenges, something strong and unbreakable had formed between them. The little girl who once trembled at every sound now walked with steady steps. The cowboy who once lived in silence now found comfort in her presence. Their bond grew not from blood, but from shared days, small efforts, and promises that had become the center of both their lives. Early mornings became a peaceful routine. Caleb would step outside to start the chores, and a pony would appear soon after, rubbing sleep from her eyes and ready to help. She fed the chickens with more confidence than before, no longer startled when they rushed toward her. Daisy, the horse she loved most, followed her like a gentle guardian. She brushed Daisy's coat, talking softly to her in a mix of English and Apache words. Caleb listened silently, warmed by the sound of her voice. Her English had improved so much that she could hold simple conversations. She often asked questions about the ranch, about the sky, about the horses. Caleb answered patiently, always surprised by how curious she was. Sometimes she asked about her mother too. When those moments came, Caleb spoke gently, never hiding the truth but making sure his words were comforting. A pony would nod quietly and look up at him with trust, the trust of someone who believed completely that he would never leave her. The town of Hollow Creek, however, still held mixed feelings. Some people softened over time, seeing how dedicated Caleb was. Others whispered whenever he came into town. But slowly, the whispers began to lose power. People watched Caleb defend a pony against harsh comments. They heard how fiercely he protected her when outlaws approached the ranch that night. They couldn't deny the truth they were becoming a family. One afternoon, the sheriff himself rode out to the ranch. Caleb was mending a fence when Sheriff Granger called his name. A pony was nearby, arranging stones into little patterns while singing softly to herself. Caleb turned to the sheriff, wiping his hands. "I'm not here to cause trouble," the sheriff said calmly. "Just need to talk." Caleb nodded, a bit cautious but respectful. Sheriff Granger stepped off his horse and looked around the ranch. "You've done a good job with her," he said, watching a pony place another small stone gently into her circle. "Never thought I'd see the day when this place echoed with a child's voice." Caleb followed his gaze and felt something warm fill his chest. "She's strong," he replied quietly. "Stronger than she knows." The sheriff nodded before clearing his throat. "But there's something you should know. A federal agent's coming today." Caleb stiffened. A pony sensed something wrong and looked toward him with worry in her eyes. Sheriff Granger raised a hand to calm him. "Now, listen. I don't know what he wants exactly, but it's likely about the girl. I want you to be ready." The sheriff rested a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "Don't panic. I've seen what you've done. I'll stand by you if things get rough." Caleb nodded slowly. He appreciated the sheriff more than he could say. Sheriff Granger mounted his horse and rode back to town, leaving the quiet ranch behind. Caleb looked down at a pony who had crawled closer to him. She tugged gently on his shirt. "Trouble?" she asked in soft English. He crouched beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'll take care of everything," he whispered. "Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid." She rested her small hand against his chest for a moment, as if trying to feel his heartbeat. Then she nodded, trusting him completely. Later that afternoon, the federal agent arrived with a sharp suit, a stiff hat, and a serious expression. Dust followed his boots as he stepped onto Caleb's porch. Aponi stayed behind Caleb, her eyes big and alert. The agent wasted no time. "I'm here about the child," he said. "An Apache girl, living unregistered with a private citizen. That's irregular. She needs to be placed under federal care." Caleb's jaw tightened. "She's under my care," he replied evenly. "Her mother entrusted her to me. Enduro, Enduro, Enduro." The agent brushed that off quickly. Sentimental words don't change the law. Caleb took a step forward, voice steady but firm. "I promised her mother. I won't break that promise." Before the agent could reply, Sheriff Granger appeared, riding up fast. He dismounted and walked between them. "Agent," the sheriff said, "this man saved the girl's life. He's given her a stable home. She's safe here." "That is not..." The sheriff raised a hand. "You've been here 5 minutes. I've watched them for months." Caleb put a hand behind him, letting Aponi hold onto him. She pressed her forehead against his back. He could feel her trembling. The agent scowled. "The law says..." "No," the sheriff interrupted firmly. "The law gives room for guardianship in special circumstances. And this is one." He pointed at Caleb. "He's the closest thing she has to family. You'll not take her from him." There was a tense silence. The agent clenched his jaw, clearly angry. But he also saw that the sheriff wouldn't back down. After a long moment, he finally turned around sharply. "This is not the end of this," he threatened before walking back to his horse. But when he rode away alone. Caleb let out a long breath. Aponi stepped around him and looked up with worried eyes. He knelt and pulled her close. She buried her face into his chest, holding him like she would never let go. "You're safe," he whispered into her hair. "You stay here. With me. No one will take you." That night, they sat by the warm fire inside the house. The sky outside was full of stars, shining softly over the quiet land. Aponi sat beside Caleb, holding a few beads and a long string. After a few minutes, she gently took his hand and placed it on her lap. She wrapped the beads around his wrist, making sure they fit just right. When she finished, she touched the bracelet gently and looked up at him. "Family," she said in clear English. The word hit Caleb like a strong wind, too soft to hurt, but powerful enough to change everything inside him. He swallowed hard. His eyes warmed with emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. He nodded slowly. "Family," he repeated. From that night onward, something settled between them that neither needed to explain. They were no longer just a cowboy and a girl. They were father and daughter, not by blood, but by choice, by trust, and by a promise stronger than anything written on paper. Over the following weeks, the town slowly began to see the truth for themselves. They saw Aponi working beside Caleb, learning ranch chores, laughing quietly, and living with a peaceful confidence. They saw how Caleb protected her, how he guided her gently, how he became softer yet stronger with her in his life. Children who once stared at her now played with her near the general store. Women who once whispered behind their hands now offered her warm bread or soft cloth for sewing. Men who once doubted Caleb now nodded respectfully when he rode by. One warm evening, Aponi stood on the porch, watching the sunset over the fields. Caleb came to stand beside her. She lifted her hand and slipped her fingers into his. He squeezed gently. "This," she said quietly, looking at the sky, "is home." Caleb looked at her small face glowing in the sunset. The little girl who once arrived frightened and alone, now stood strong and safe at his side. "Yes," he said softly, "this is home." He remembered the dying whisper of her mother, the trust placed in his hands. And he knew deep inside that he had kept that promise, not just with words, but with every choice he made. A lonely cowboy had become a father. A frightened girl had become a daughter. And together, they had become a family the world never expected, but one the world could never break.